1944, Casino Sector, Italy. Rain hammered the canvas. Cold moved through boots and bone. A lantern swung its light over metal instruments. An ampule flashed. Outside, distant salvos made the tent shiver. A stretcher thudded onto the canvas. Young paratrooper, smock torn, breath shallow and quick. Blood darkened his side. The face was only someone trying to breathe. Nora tightened a bandage roll and passed the lantern's handle so the surgeon could see. "He's the enemy. He's a patient. Orders say wait. I won't." Arthur's hand hovered above the ampule. The lantern painted his knuckles gold. Somewhere a jeep idled and a sergeant's voice called names, precise and impossible to hear over the rain. He felt orders in his pocket and the heavier weight on the table. His thumb found the ampule's neck. The scalpel hovered. Mercy where hate was expected. A lantern's halo over a gloved hand above a foreign chest. Outside, artillery kept time. Inside, medicine and war overlapped. Command pressed one way, oath the other. Strength meant letting humanity decide. The small, stubborn mercy that shifts the line between combatant and patient. If true stories of courage under oath keep you listening, subscribe for more. Arthur worked in a casualty clearing station behind Casino's lines, February 1944. Infantry, paratroopers, POWs, blood and fear the same. Arthur Reeves, senior surgeon, Nora Campbell, nurse rationing morphine. Medics triaged fast under shelling and fragile supply. Military commands set priorities. Propaganda hardened enemy lines into abstractions. Yet conventions existed to carve out a small space of civility. A red cross on canvas. The principle that a dying man is a patient first. A jeep's headlights cut through the rain and a stretcher slid out fast. Another urgent case arriving. The medics who brought him in moved with the practiced speed of people elected by circumstance to steady the world. One hauled the bar at the head, another checked pulses, a third peeled back a torn smock to find the dark bloom at the flank. Matthias Vogel arrived as an object of contradiction. An enemy soldier in uniform, ragged and shivering, but a human whose chest rose and fell with the same brittle rhythm as any other dying man. Nora leaned over him, fingers that had tied 1,000 bandages checking the small signs that decided life or delay. Capillary refill, a shallow breath that rattled like someone straining to speak through cloth. A medic said, low and clipped, "Near the liver." Arthur crouched, hand steadying the lantern so that the light cut the wet air into manageable pieces. "If he's bleeding internally, he won't wait," the orderly murmured. "We move fast." The stretcher met the metal tray with a hard, clean sound. In the flurry of that moment, the team performed their ritual. A quick tear of cloth, a count of limbs, a whispered name into a notebook that might later be a file. Triage is a moral ledger. Combat effective first, hopeless last, on paper. The Red Cross and the smell of anesthetic kept another order alive. The patient is a patient. Under shells, choices were blood, time, and scarce supplies, and their weight outlived the logbook. The initial assessment was clinical, but humane. A gauze pressed, a hand on a forehead to feel fever or shock, a voice asking one practical question. "Can he speak?" Matthias answered with a name half-formed in English. "Elise," he breathed, and the syllable landed in the tent as if it might hold him to life. Names matter in a place designed to make people anonymous by labels, casualty, number, platoon, and the name made the decision personal. The medics recorded the wound and murmured to one another about reserves and evacuation windows. Shelling sounded again beyond the canvas, a distant punctuation that moved the room toward haste. A stretcher became a ledger line, and the medics a sudden congress convened for one quick vote. The vote would be counted in ampules and bandage rolls, in minutes before the next barrage, in whether a surgical field could be improvised under a lamp that swayed with each gust. Each breath the man took pressed the team to answer. Was this a man to be mended now, or a risk to the mission if treated before those with orders higher on the slate. Nora moved methodically, bandage rolls set beside the tray, each centimeter a choice. Arthur knew the order, prisoner's weight, and the pulse under his fingers. Skill is economy. Their first acts would measure the day. The tense light splashed across faces and objects and left shadows long as doubts. Outside, the noise of war marched on, indifferent to that small interior debate. Inside, Arthur felt each rule like a pressure on his skin, the military hierarchy that demanded obedience, the medic's ethic that demanded an oath. He arranged the instruments with the care of someone knowing the margin between clean and contaminated was a slim place. A troop of men might be governed by orders, but a single patient in need forced a different calculus, an arithmetic of urgency rather than allegiance. The Geneva principle that medical personnel treat the wounded without discrimination was not a legal phrase there. It was a practice that might cost a man his place in the chain of command, but could not be ignored by the conscience that took up a scalpel. When the decision was made to carry him through to the operating area, it was quietly obvious. The bandage roll tightened, the lantern steadied, and the team moved as though the tent itself had decided to shelter a small island of other law. Later, the log would read, "Priority adjusted, patient stabilized, evacuation pending." In the moment, hands chose before paper. They counted supplies with the same care a treasurer counts coins. The morphine kit was opened, and the ampules lined like tiny vials of possible salvation. Nora worked quickly, each movement precise, folding gauze to make a sterile field on the small, improvised table. "One ampule left," she said, the words small and hard. She had the language of scarcity in her palms. She had learned to stretch an analgesic across hours and men and the uneven arrivals of a battlefield. The ampule glinted beneath the lantern. Its glass neck was thin as a decision. There was an economy in that small bottle, enough to put under a knife, just enough to make an operation humane. Used elsewhere, it might give a wounded comrade a night without terror. The calculation lodged in the air like steam. Who gets the last morphine is a survival sum, not a seminar. Order said, prioritize the unit. Mercy risked reprimand. Arthur felt the glass between his fingers then, as if it were an accuser. He had been trained to conserve and to do no harm, and he had also been trained to follow orders that kept units functioning. There is a precise, almost surgical conflict between those two teachings when only one ampule exists. Nora looked at him, and in her face, there was no question of sentimentality, only the clear accounting of a nurse who had kept men breathing through nights of mud. "Who needs it more?" she asked, and her voice was the voice of someone who knew the price of delay. That question made the rest of the tent hold its breath. The choice would not be abstract. It would be tested with the man on the table and the man in the next cot and the time in which the enemy shells decided whether roofs stayed standing. Arthur snapped the ampule. The liquid rose slow into the syringe. Restraint in dosing, steady hands, and a simple claim. The oath sometimes stands apart from orders. The operation itself was conducted under a lantern's yellow spill, instruments placed on a tray that had seen many nights. Arthur scrubbed and incised with the motions of a man trained to move the fastest where the stakes were highest. The wound was close to the liver, an area that can bleed in silence until the body's pressure can no longer hold. He worked with a focus that stripped the tent of extraneous noise. He listened only for the sound of blood and the small mechanical music of clamps and forceps. Nora watched the field and handed instruments as if she were the conductor of a tiny orchestra whose score was life. Matthias, eyes half closed, clung to the syllable of a name as if it anchored him. He whispered once more, a small, clear sound despite the analgesic now in his veins. "Elise," he said. "I held her hand. I didn't shoot her." Arthur paused as if the words itself might change the anatomy of the wound. Field surgery is technique and improvisation. Stop bleeding, prevent infection, close to transport. Each suture said the body deserved care, uniform aside. Midway through the operation, a sergeant's silhouette filled the tent flap, the outline of authority momentarily larger than the lantern. He carried a folded dispatch and the rectitude that comes in uniform. "You know the orders," he said. Words snapped like a strap, and they landed between the instruments and the patient. Arthur, with blood on his gloves and the smell of antiseptic in his nostrils, did not look up immediately. The presence of the sergeant was a reminder that the military structure watched even the sterile field. "We are treating him," Arthur answered simply, voice steady. "He arrived in extremis. He will be stabilized for evacuation." The sergeant's jaw worked. Discipline and the need for clear channels of movement argued for compliance. "You risk a reprimand." The tense air turned thin with potential consequence. Authority in war is meant to shape predictable behavior. Units follow orders, supplies move according to manifest, prisoners are processed according to law. Medical spaces are designed to be exceptions, but exceptions are fragile. A reprimand might mean transfer, a logbook note, or worse. It might also mean a broken pattern of care for those left behind. In the friction between command and care, the medical officer becomes both servant to an institution and guardian of a promise. That promise, the oath taken by physicians and echoed by nurses and medics, places patient welfare above the political identity of the wounded. To follow the oath can be to risk personal consequence. To follow orders without regard for the man in front of you can be to betray a core tenet of the profession. The sergeant took in the scene, the patient being tended, the ampule utilized, the instruments in motion, and chose, in a small human pause, not to escalate. Discipline sustained by watching the pragmatic success of care can bend toward mercy when presented with the reality of a hand on a chest and the slow improvement of a pulse. In the hours after, the ward settled into what looked like routine: a patient list, an improvised bedside observation, and the hush of men sleeping off shock. The British corporal in the next cot, awake and groggy from his own quick dressing, had seen the operation and would later speak of it in tones that were more pragmatic than heroic. "Do what you have to do," he said through a throat still raw from morphine. The small fraternity of those who had come through the tent that night recognized a truth seldom spoken openly. Survival across the ridge depends less on clear allegiance than on the hands that keep a man breathing. The corporal's muttered acquiescence was not a moral pronouncement but a human one. It acknowledged that while orders made the world legible, the immediate fact of someone's breath made it urgent. Recovery in a clearing station is a slow reclamation of normalcy. A man who was minutes from exsanguination might later sit propped on a pillow, offered a cup of tea from a dented canteen, and allowed a moment in which the face of the enemy ceases to be a uniform and rejoins the shape of a person. The canteen cup passed through hands of different creeds without ceremony, its metal cool against mouths that had shouted at one another hours before. Small acts, a clean bandage, a cup of water, the steadying touch of a nurse, are where the medical mission and the moral life intersect. Documentation follows. A name recorded, a wound described, a plan for evacuation made. The paperwork was the bridge that translated a field decision into a sanctioned action. Done correctly, it softened the sting of having once tilted procedure away from strict orders toward immediate need. Witnesses in the tent became storytellers outside of it. The corporal who had said, "Do what you have to do," would later recount the night when a British surgeon used the last ampule for an enemy. He told the story not to praise disobedience, but to note a steadiness that kept their small world functioning. The medic who saved a life without asking allegiance. That steadiness is not naive. It is pragmatic. Soldiers and medics understand that today's enemy may be tomorrow's neighbor or the man whose son occupies the same trench. The act of saving an enemy did not rewrite the battle plan, but it preserved a human being whose existence would otherwise have been erased. And in doing so, it upheld a professional code that said to heal first, ask later. Toward dawn, the man on the table stirred with a fragile coherence. His eyes opened, unfocused, and for a breath he searched the faces around him. Arthur leaned close, the lantern casting tired halos. "You're safe for now," Arthur said, not as a command, but as a fact. Matthias's hand found Arthur's, a small animal motion of dependence that leveled the historical weight of their identities for a single second. "Elise," he whispered again, voice raw but steadier, and Arthur felt the syllable like a rumor of a life beyond the mud. In that whisper was confession and plea. It made the stranger human in a way orders could not. Arthur answered simply, "I'll tell her." And the promise was not political but personal. Recording the episode was a task of a different kind. The logbook would show numbers and times, patient stabilized, ampule utilized, evacuation pending. There would be no rhetoric in those lines, only the sober fact of care given. Yet behind that entry was a larger datum, the quiet act of choosing to honor an oath under the pressure of command. The decision did not erase the war outside the canvas. Shells still fell, and men continued to face each other across lines drawn by strategy and fear. But inside the tent, the professional choice to treat the wounded without discrimination stood as a small counterweight to ideology. It was not a gesture meant for public consumption, but for the preservation of a standard, that medical hands act for the patient, not the flag. Those who watched the scene would later argue in small ways about what they had seen. Some would call it simple decency. Others would call it adherence to the Geneva principle that the wounded must be treated without regard to nationality. The language used varied, but the effect was the same. A man who might have been left to bled out for the sake of a company directive was instead given another hour of life, another chance for testimony and regret, and possibly for reunion. The nurse's bandage roll and the surgeon's steady hand combined to create a narrow corridor where mercy and duty overlapped rather than collided. That corridor is where the profession defines itself, by the small, disciplined acts that preserve life and record its preservation in dry ink. Night ebbed, and the tent quieted into a watchful dawn. A stretcher left for the evacuation point, carrying a man whose pulse had steadied and whose breath no longer seemed like a thin thread against the dark. The sergeant who had stood in the doorway earlier adjusted his cap and, without comment, allowed the team to continue their work. The decision had been taken in a place where policy met personhood, and the procedural record would be written to make sense of it later. For Arthur and Nora, the night had been a test of a professional creed, to place the patient's immediate needs over an impersonal hierarchy when the two could not easily be reconciled. The Dictionary of Medicine and War has many entries, but one unambiguous line remained. The oath calls for care, and sometimes care requires restraint from following orders that would deny it. Outside, the ridge bled into morning with the pale light catching on wet canvas, and the distant rumble reduced to a memory for the men who tended the wounded. Inside, life continued in quotidian gestures, the cleaning of instruments, the folding of bandages, the ticking of a watch that kept track of when the evacuation truck would arrive. Small, resolute acts, a recorded name, a filled ampule, a promise whispered into a stranger's ear, accumulated into a pattern that would mark that night in the logbooks and in the memories of those present. The tent had been a fragile locus where the oath met orders and where mercy, chosen in the span of a hand's movement, held. After the shelter of the lantern and the first steadying of a pulse, the clearing station settled into the slow, surgical rhythm of recovery. Men who might have bled out lay propped on cots, eyes closed or fixed on small, private things. A letter folded twice, a rosary, the seam of a trouser that had once been clean. The tent gave up its fevered motion and became, for a time, a place of small domestic chores, rebundling dressings, changing saline bottles in tins, wiping mud from a face as gently as one might wipe a child's. Arthur passed between cots with the quiet competence of someone remaking order out of injury. He inspected dressings, checked respirations, and listened for the soft irregularities that signal infection or hemorrhage. His movements were clinical. His attention, however, held the weight of the earlier decision. The ampule's empty glass sat on the tray like a small and private witness. Nora moved through these tasks with even hands. She filled the canteen with what hot water they had and offered a cup to a man with a throat scorched by morphine and fear. "Drink," she said in a voice that was not a command so much as a bridge to presence. The corporal at the next cot accepted the cup and sipped slowly, metal cool against his lips. The cup passed between uniforms and accents with no ceremony. Objects in a field hospital acquire new meanings. The bandage roll becomes a measure of how many more lives can be tended. A dented canteen becomes proof that someone has been offered comfort. These tactile acts were not merely practical, they were the day-to-day enactment of the oath that Arthur had honored under pressure. Small gestures bound together a group of strangers into a temporary community of care. A week later, when the immediate danger had eased enough for a ration of sleep, Arthur walked outside the tent to find the ridge quiet in a way war rarely allowed. He stood for a long moment under a sky that had not yet chosen color and thought of the man who had whispered a name. He had not been the first to tend an enemy, but he knew that each instance carried a risk. A complaint filed, an order read differently by a temporary superior, a career nudged toward an administrative post far from patience. He had also seen what saving a life did to the living, how it could reframe small units of meaning in the harsh arithmetic of war. Mercy, he had told himself that night, is an act of restraint, choosing to refuse the quickest compliance in favor of a longer, more costly integrity. The field hospital continued to receive them in waves. Men from the front, local civilians pulled from shattered houses, and occasionally, more prisoners brought perhaps by units that followed the orders more literally. Each arrival forced another triage, another moral calculus. The arrival of a conscript with a collapsed lung meant a quick decision to allocate a scarce chest drain kit. The discovery of a bandaged child in a refugee column meant rationing a blood transfusion that could not easily be improvised. In each case, Arthur and Nora applied the same rules they had always applied: assess, stabilize, and prioritize the dying and the salvageable. The distinction was not always easy. A field hospital is the place where pragmatism and principle meet and sometimes tangle. The Geneva Convention provided a rubric: wounded are to be cared for without discrimination, but practice required balancing that rubric with available supplies and evacuation windows. One afternoon, an inspector from Divisional Medical Headquarters arrived with the crisp authority of someone who carried doctrine in his satchel. He wore clean boots and a concern for records that stood clear against the tent's smudged canvas. He wanted to see how supplies were logged, whether the Red Cross was placed properly, how many ampules remained. His ledger was neat, his questions were pointed. "We must be accountable," he said, as though the ledger itself could make the ethics beyond dispute. Arthur toured him through the rows of cots, naming numbers and injuries, pointing to bandage counts and the organized jars of antiseptic. The inspector paused at the cot where Matthias rested, his face pale but breathing easier. He noted the empty ampoule on the tray and the change in the supply sheet. "You used a morphine ampoule on a prisoner?" the inspector asked, voice low but incredulous. "Orders are clear about prisoner processing." Arthur answered with the blandness of procedure. He arrived in extremis. Stabilization allowed safe evacuation. Patient first. The inspector tapped a finger on the logbook where Arthur had written precise words. Patient stabilized. Ampule utilized. Evacuation pending. "The chain of command exists for a reason," he said. "We cannot afford emotional exception." The words carried the weight of hierarchy and bureaucracy necessary, too often unmoved by immediacies. Nora watched the exchange with a guarded face. "The medical officer made a clinical decision," she said simply. We treated according to need." Her voice carried the quiet force of years spent prioritizing breaths. The inspector stared at her for a long moment, then at the steady pulse displayed on the crude monitor. The formality of his tone gave way to a reluctant practicality. "Record it well," he said finally, "and justify where necessary. We will review the report." He left with his ledger, his steps efficient on the muddy path. The tent watched him go and then resumed its quieter work, as if the sheer act of attention had passed through it without altering the core fact of care. Authority could rustle papers. It took much more than ledger lines to change the hands that tied bandages and kept men breathing. There were other forms of pressure that arrived from the rank and file in subtler ways. Rumor moved across camps like a different kind of artillery, slower, insistent, shaping opinions. The story of a surgeon using the last ampule for an enemy man traveled from tent to tent, trimmed and reshaped by each telling. Some chose to scorn it as foolishness. Others, like the corporal who slept across from Matthias, told it with the pragmatic approval of someone who had seen the benefit. "We don't win if everyone dies," he would say. "A man alive is of use in more ways than the patrols think." Words like that reframed the event, not as mutiny, but as collective survival. It is notable how practical considerations can make room for moral reasoning. Soldiers speak in terms of effect more often than justice, and practical outcomes can validate acts of mercy where doctrine alone might not. The presence of Matthias in the ward created unexpected exchanges. A young private with a scarred hand sat opposite him one afternoon and started to ask questions through the tentative common tongue of the wounded. "Where from?" the private asked haltingly. "Munich," Matthias answered in fractured English. "Elise, Padua, my village." The private nodded, eyes softening in fatigue. "You held her hand," he said, focusing on the small human detail as if it were an island of story in a sea of strategy. Matthias's answer was a small, exhausted smile and a gesture that took little muscle but enormous sincerity. The private produced a scrap of paper and a pencil and handed it across, an odd currency in that place. "Write her name down," he said, "so someone knows." Names became a fragile ledger of connection. The nurse on duty who cataloged the patients took extra care writing Matthias Vogel, mentions Elise, in a thin column of a folded card. That small notation would be part of the record that might survive the chaos of transfer and might reach a station where someone could find her. Bureaucracy, which sometimes constrains action, here became a tool of compassion. The paper trail could allow a promise to be kept, a message delivered, or at least a fact preserved against time and distance. The logbook, which had been feared by Arthur at the inspector's arrival, now looked like a bridge between the tent and the world beyond it. Even as the immediate crisis eased, resource scarcity remained a quiet companion. Blood, in particular, was a commodity always in tense supply. The clearing station mounted a small program of donor rounds when time allowed. Able-bodied men came forward to give blood in measured quantities to stabilize the most at-risk patients. The medic, who organized the donor list, did so with the same efficient care with which he had once pulled a man from a burning vehicle. On the day of the donor round, Arthur watched as soldiers volunteered in a different sense than they had in combat. There was no fanfare, only the sober, almost ritual motion of dispatching a legible unit of blood from one warm body to another. One man, who had been stitched for a minor shrapnel wound, rolled up his sleeve and offered his veins without hesitation, compassion and duty shaped in the same gesture. Conversations returned often to the moral language of their profession. Late one night, after rounds had been made and the ward had sighed into relative stillness, Arthur and Nora sat with a small tin of tea between them. The lantern on the tray cast a worn light, and the remains of the ampule glinted in the shadow. "You did the right thing," Nora said at last, not as admonition, but as recognition. Arthur did not argue. He replied in the spare language of those who have weighed decision. "I did what I swore to do," he said. "The oath is not rhetoric. It is what we do when everything else requires us to choose between two wrong paths." Their voices were low. The tent listened and offered no verdict beyond the steady rasp of breath from the cots. Matthias's recovery was incremental. Over the days, he grew stronger in controlled measures. The wound closed, fever retreated, and he started to speak more clearly. He wrote sometimes in halting English on the scrap paper the private had given him, scribbling a name or a town, and then erasing and writing again. On one afternoon, when the shelling had quieted into an occasional far-off scud, he pulled Arthur aside and pressed a folded scrap into the surgeon's hand. On it, in uneven script, was a short note. "Elise, Padua, house near the river. Tell her." Arthur read it, felt the small human weight of the request, and put it into his breast pocket. The question of what to do with such a request is not trivial. On the one hand, a surgeon is not a diplomat. On the other, the human act of carrying a message across battle lines has long histories of its own. Arthur knew that passing the note forward might mean involving chaplains, liaison officers, or the military police, all of whom moved on different timetables and with different priorities. He also knew that to leave the request unrecorded was to dishonor the brief intimacy formed in the operating light. He filed the scrap of paper into the patient's notes, annotated the chart with a line asking that the message be transported with Matthias upon evacuation. He trusted in the slow machinery of the hospital to carry the small mercy forward. Not all decisions were met with understanding. A few officers grumbled about the use of scarce sedative for a man who might return to fight for the other side. A whispered complaint, delivered to a junior officer, found its way into a dry dispatch. Questionable use of supplies on enemy personnel. Review required. Such notes travel through command like a cold wind. The hospital received notice that a formal inquiry might be held when time allowed. For Arthur and the staff, this meant living with a low, persistent anxiety, a worry that the rightness of the act might be judged under a different rubric. Yet they continued their work because the immediate needs of patients obliged continued attention. As the weeks passed and the phase of combat shifted, the clearing station became a node in a larger network. Patients, once stabilized, were moved on to larger hospitals further back. Matthias was scheduled for evacuation with a convoy that would cross lines and pass through checkpoints. Before he left, he sat up one morning and looked around at those who had kept him. The private who had become his small friend came to stand by his cot, awkward with the weight of not knowing how to say goodbye. "Be careful," the private said. "Remember what you told me?" Matthias laughed softly and answered, "I had to do it. Elise, no time." His voice was practical, struggling with guilt and gratitude in equal measures. On the morning of his evacuation, the public ritual of departure was modest. A stretcher was prepared, papers checked, and Arthur signed the required lines. The sergeant who had once warned Arthur about following orders adjusted his cap as the convoy formed up. There was no trumpet, no ceremony, only the crisp efficiency of men and medical notes aligning. As Matthias was lifted onto the truck, he reached for Arthur's hand and then for Nora's. He whispered in English, his voice thin but clear. "Tell Elise, I kept her hand." Arthur nodded, the lantern in his memory like a small, stubborn son. "I'll tell her," he said again, and the words were as much a promise as a recording instruction. The convoy rolled away, carrying the wounded into the patient streams that would decide their futures. In the clearing station, the tide of events reshaped the space in small ways. The empty cot, the cleaned tray, the neat but now commonplace presence of the ampule's glass remains. Arthur returned to the logbook and made his entries not only with precision, but with the heavier handwriting of someone who had spent energy on more than transcription. He had invested himself in the life of another. The act of writing allowed a different kind of care, one that used ink instead of suture to secure a fact against the possibility of erasure. As news circulated, the story of the night in the tent accumulated marginalia, small additions that turned event into narrative. Some accounts emphasized the steadiness of the surgeon's hand, others the nurse's practical economy. A chaplain, passing through, wrote a brief note about the moral courage he had witnessed, and in his letter to headquarters he included a line about the way the Geneva emblem had been upheld in a time of scarcity. These documents, when collected, formed a mosaic of testimony that would later be used in quiet discussions about policy and practice. The raw act, opening the ampule, making the incision, saying a name, was preserved in the more durable forms of paper and testimony. In months to come, the detail of Matthias's claim that he had not fired on a woman named Elise and rather had held her hand became a pivot in how those present remembered the night. To some, it showed the need to assume complexity in the face of simplified enemy narratives. To others, it reinforced the professional code that cleansed identities at the foot of a stretcher. For Arthur and Nora, it was part of the daily ledger of practice, another instance when the oath required them to place patient welfare above the convenience of an unchallenged order. The choice to do so was not heroic in the public sense. It was the quiet, painstaking application of a standard that had little room for grand gestures, but required a great deal of personal resolve. There is a specific kind of fatigue that follows such decisions, a threading of moral exertion into the muscles that remain after a long shift. Arthur would sometimes catch himself in the small hours writing lines in a notebook that were not official but personal. Names, small observations, a question about whether the systems that govern war properly accommodate mercy. He recorded the name Elise not as a data point, but as a memory, a tiny talisman against the reduction of human beings to categories. The oath he had taken had been stated in different words when he was a student, but its meaning crystallized in the tent, to act first for the patient, even when the patient wore the uniform of the enemy soldier. The clearing station, like all mobile hospitals, was ephemeral. Tents were struck and relocated as the front shifted. When the unit moved, the team left behind the tray that had held the ampule, the dented canteen, and the bandage roll that had been used sparingly. They took with them the logbooks and the small privately kept notes that would travel with them as a record of decisions made and lives saved. Arthur tucked the scrap of paper with Elise's address into a pocket of his logbook. It was not merely a note, but a promise folded into the practicalities of war. The field hospital's work was to make such promises possible within the machinery of command and to survive checks and inspections by aligning moral acts with documented procedure. In the months that followed, in letters written home and accounts recounted in small messes, the story of the ampule and the whisper would reappear. It would be told with different emphases, sometimes as a demonstration of professional ethics, sometimes as an anecdote of human decency in a place that demanded otherwise. For Arthur, the night remained a test not of courage as spectacle, but of the quieter restraint that the oath required, an exercise in choosing to preserve life even when doing so risked friction with the structures that govern war. Mercy, in that sense, was not an indulgence, but an expression of strength, the capacity to withhold strict obedience in favor of a higher, harder fidelity to the person before you. Through that winter into the thaw of spring, the little acts continued. The bandage roll kept on the tray, the lantern that swung and dimmed, the careful entries in the logbook. These were the habitual forms through which a profession practiced its principles. The truth of that night remained less an isolated moral drama and more an example of a consistent ethic of care that informed each choice thereafter. In a world organized by lines and orders, the medical tent carved its own narrow space where the first duty was to the patient's life, not to allegiances or to rhetoric. That space was defended not by guns, but by the discipline of hands that refused to refuse. If this story stayed with you, like and share, it helps the channel reach more people.